It was a quiet evening on the outskirts of town. The air felt still, and the streets were almost empty, with only the occasional car passing by. Officer James Riley was driving his patrol car along the lonely stretch of road, his eyes scanning the area. It had been a slow night, and he was used to the silence. The hum of the engine and the faint rustling of trees were the only sounds that accompanied him as he made his rounds. As he glanced at the clock on his dashboard, he noticed it was already past midnight. He sighed, wondering when he would get some real action. His thoughts drifted off as his fingers drummed lightly on the steering wheel. It wasn't unusual for the town to be so quiet at this hour, especially with the cold setting in. But tonight felt different, like there was something in the air. It was a feeling he couldn't explain, just an odd sense of unease. Suddenly, there was a sound that broke the stillness. The sound of tires screeching against the pavement. Officer Riley quickly turned his head, his heart skipping a beat. A car was speeding past him, much too fast for the area. It was an old beat-up sedan, its headlights blinding for a moment before it disappeared into the distance. Riley's instincts kicked in immediately. Without hesitation, he turned on his siren and followed the car. The sound of the siren echoed in the otherwise empty night, creating an eerie atmosphere. The sedan swerved slightly, as though the driver wasn't sure how to react. Riley frowned as he kept his distance, carefully watching the car. It wasn't often that someone would be driving at such high speeds on this quiet road, especially this late at night. Something wasn't right. As he kept pace with the speeding car, he noticed the driver didn't seem to be slowing down. In fact, the sedan kept getting farther and farther ahead, as if the driver was determined to escape. Officer Riley's grip on the steering wheel tightened. This wasn't just a simple case of speeding. It felt like something more. Maybe the driver was running from something or someone. Maybe this was about more than just breaking the speed limit. After a few more minutes of high-speed driving, the sedan suddenly veered to the right, pulling over to the side of the road. The headlights blinked off, and the car came to a complete stop. Riley's breath caught in his chest. There was something strange about the way the car had stopped. Too sudden, too deliberate. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. What was going on? He slowed his patrol car to a stop behind the sedan and turned off his siren, making the night feel even more still and eerie. He could barely see inside the car. The windows were tinted, but he could make out a figure sitting in the driver's seat. As he approached the vehicle cautiously, Riley's mind raced. Was this just a routine traffic stop, or was there something bigger going on here? He tapped on the window, his flashlight shining in the driver's face. The man inside rolled down the window just enough for Riley to see his eyes. There was something odd about the way the driver looked. Nervous, maybe even terrified. His hands were trembling slightly as they gripped the steering wheel. "Good evening," Riley said, trying to sound calm despite the rising tension. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he shifted his eyes to the backseat, glancing nervously over his shoulder. Riley's gaze followed the driver's, but he couldn't see anything through the tinted windows of the back. "Is everything all right, sir?" Riley asked, his voice low and steady, though inside, his curiosity was growing. The man's reaction didn't seem normal. There was something he wasn't telling him, and really was beginning to feel it deep in his gut. Just then, the silence between them seemed to stretch out. The man looked back at Riley with a quick, uneasy glance. Then, almost too quickly, he rolled the window up, his eyes darting away. Riley paused for a second, unsure of what to do next. The feeling of unease was now a cold knot in his stomach. There was something wrong with this situation, something he couldn't yet explain. But Officer Riley knew one thing for sure. He had to find out what it was. Officer Riley stood still for a moment, his hand resting on his holster. The strange behavior of the driver was unsettling, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever might come next. Slowly, he walked towards the driver's side of the sedan, keeping his flashlight aimed toward the car. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the scene. As Riley reached the car, the driver still hadn't made any move to roll the window down fully. The air between them was thick with tension, and the officer could feel his heart beating faster. He took another step closer to the vehicle, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. The driver's hands, still gripping the steering wheel tightly, looked as if they were about to snap from the pressure. "Sir, please step out of the vehicle," Riley said in a firm but calm tone. For a moment, there was no response. The driver seemed to hesitate, his gaze shifting nervously from the officer's face to the road ahead. Officer Riley's eyes never left him as he waited for a response. The driver finally exhaled sharply and slowly began to open the door, stepping out with noticeable reluctance. The man was tall, with disheveled hair and worn clothes, as though he had been traveling for a long time. His face was pale, his eyes darting to every corner of the road, like he was looking for an escape. Riley was trying to read him, trying to understand why the man seemed so unnerved. Nothing about this situation was adding up. "Is everything okay, sir?" Riley asked again, his voice a little firmer this time. The man quickly nodded but avoided looking directly at the officer. "Yeah, it's fine," he muttered, his voice shaky. "I'm just tired, been driving all night." Riley wasn't convinced. There was an edge to the man's voice, and his body language was giving him away. Riley had been a cop long enough to recognize when someone was hiding something. The nervous glances, the tension in his posture, there was something this driver didn't want to talk about. But what? What was the real reason he was out here, on this deserted road, at this time of night? "Why don't you tell me where you're headed?" Riley asked, hoping to get a better understanding of the situation. The driver shifted uncomfortably, swallowing hard before answering. Just passing through," he said, his words coming out strained. "Nothing to see here, just need to get home, that's all." Riley nodded, but he wasn't buying it. He glanced at the back of the sedan, wondering if there was anything that could explain the driver's odd behavior. He had already noticed how the man kept glancing at the backseat, as though there was something or someone he didn't want Riley to see. "I'm going to need to take a look inside," Riley said, stepping closer to the car. The man stiffened. His eyes widened for a split second, and in that moment, Riley knew he was onto something. There was no reason for this man to react like that unless there was something in the backseat he was trying to hide. Something or someone. Riley moved around to the other side of the car and peered into the backseat, his flashlight scanning the interior. It was dark, and the faint glow of the streetlights barely revealed anything. But as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw something. A small shape, sitting perfectly still, tucked away in the far corner of the seat. Riley's heart skipped a beat. It was a child. A young girl, no older than 6 or 7, sat quietly in the backseat, her wide eyes staring straight ahead. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was clutching a small stuffed bear. She didn't make a sound, her tiny figure almost blending into the shadows. Riley's breath caught in his throat. Something was definitely wrong. The driver's behavior now made more sense. He was hiding the girl. But why? Why would someone be so secretive about a child? Turning back to the driver, Riley's voice softened, but there was a new seriousness in his tone. "Who is she? Is she okay?" The man's gaze flickered nervously as he stammered, She's fine. She's my daughter." Riley didn't believe him for a second. Something about the way he said it, the fear in his voice, told him that this wasn't just a simple family trip gone awry. Something far darker was unfolding right before his eyes. He took a step back, considering his next move carefully. He couldn't let the man get away with this, whatever it was. The officer knew that his next action would change everything. He couldn't just walk away from this. The little girl's presence in the backseat was a warning sign, and really knew he had to dig deeper, before it was too late. The tension in the air was thick as Officer Riley stood by the sedan, his flashlight casting long shadows over the vehicle. His mind raced with questions. The driver's behavior was bizarre, and the little girl in the backseat only made things feel more unsettling. Riley had seen many strange things in his years on the force, but this was different. This didn't feel like a simple traffic stop. He couldn't just stand there. The child in the backseat needed to be checked on. He couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut, the one telling him that something was wrong, deeply wrong. Riley's heart raced as he slowly walked to the back of the sedan. The man's nervous eyes followed his every move. The officer paused for a moment before carefully opening the back door. The sudden rush of cold air that hit him sent a shiver down his spine. The little girl sat completely still in the far corner of the backseat, her small hands still clutching the stuffed bear. Riley's breath caught in his throat. She didn't look like she was scared. She looked trapped. Her wide, dark eyes stared straight ahead, unblinking, almost like she was in a trance. Riley's stomach twisted. There was something about the way she sat there that didn't sit right with him. He took a step closer, kneeling down so he could get a better look. The child didn't acknowledge him at first. She didn't blink, didn't move, just stared ahead, as if lost in thought or maybe, just maybe, afraid to move. The silence between them stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Riley's mind raced. Was the child okay? Why wasn't she saying anything? Why was she so still? He gently cleared his throat, hoping to snap her out of whatever daze she was in. "Hey there," he said softly. "Are you all right?" For a brief moment, Riley thought the girl wouldn't respond. But then, ever so slowly, she turned her head to look at him. Her eyes met his, and there was something in them, something that made his heart ache. It wasn't fear. It wasn't sadness. It was pleading. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Riley leaned in, trying to catch whatever she was trying to say, but her lips trembled, and her voice stayed silent. It was like she was trying to speak but couldn't. Riley's instincts kicked in. He knew that a child who couldn't speak in a situation like this was a serious red flag. "Hey," Riley said more urgently now. "You can tell me. What's going on?" For a second, Riley thought she might say something, anything, but then her gaze shifted. It wasn't at Riley, but something behind him. She glanced at her father, who was standing near the front of the car, looking away nervously. The little girl didn't speak again, but her eyes spoke volumes. She was trying to communicate with Riley, trying to tell him something important without saying a word. It was then that Riley noticed something strange. The stuffed bear in her hands was worn and tattered. The edges were frayed, the fur matted. It wasn't the kind of toy a child would carry if they were just on a regular trip. It looked more like something that had been clutched for comfort through something darker. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. There was no way he could ignore this. Whatever was going on here, it wasn't just an innocent father and daughter on a late-night drive. Riley's hand hovered near his radio, considering whether to call for backup. But just as he was about to reach for it, he heard a soft sound. The little girl's voice, barely a whisper. "Help me," she said, her voice trembling, almost lost in the night air. Riley's eyes widened. The girl had spoken. It was as if the words were ripped from her, desperate and filled with fear. He quickly looked up at the father, who was now visibly sweating, his eyes wide in panic. "Sir," Riley said, his voice now cold. "What is going on? Who is she?" The driver's face went pale. His hands shook as he clenched them into fists. She's just my daughter," he stammered. Please, officer, she's fine. I just need to get her home." Riley could see the panic in the man's eyes. He wasn't telling the truth, and the more he tried to convince the officer otherwise, the more suspicious he seemed. But it was the girl's words that stayed with Riley. "Help me." That phrase echoed in his mind, louder than anything else. Riley stood up straight, trying to keep his composure. He looked at the little girl again, who was still staring at him, her eyes wide with unspoken fear. He needed to get to the bottom of this. The girl had just confirmed what he'd already suspected. Something was terribly wrong. This was no simple traffic stop. This wasn't just a father and daughter on a late-night drive. Riley had to act quickly. Time was running out, and wherever this man was hiding, it was something far more dangerous than he had first imagined. Without hesitation, Riley made his decision. He wasn't letting this go. Not now. Not when the girl had asked for help. He was going to find out what was really going on. And he wasn't going to let the man get away with whatever he was trying to hide. Officer Riley's mind raced as he stood next to the sedan, his flashlight casting long shadows across the car. The little girl's terrified eyes were still etched in his memory, her silent plea for help echoing in his thoughts. He knew he had to act fast. He couldn't let this man slip away with whatever was going on. He glanced at the driver, who was still standing near the front of the car, looking increasingly nervous. The officer could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Something wasn't right. The way the man kept looking at the little girl, his constant fidgeting, it was all too strange. Why would a father act like this? Was it fear, guilt, or something far worse? Riley's eyes narrowed as he looked back at the car. The driver was sweating now, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand as he shifted from foot to foot. He was acting like someone who had been caught doing something terrible, not a father who was simply giving his daughter a ride. "Sir," Riley said, his voice firm but controlled, "I'm going to need you to step over here with me for a moment. I need to ask you a few more questions." The man hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking to the back seat before slowly complying. He took a few steps toward Riley, but the tension between them felt unbearable. Riley couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He had to get to the bottom of it. He had to know what the man was hiding. The officer stepped a few paces away from the sedan and motioned for the driver to stand in front of him. Riley looked him up and down, trying to gauge his behavior. The man's hands were shaking, and he couldn't seem to make eye contact for more than a few seconds. Riley was used to seeing nervousness in people, but this was different. The driver was too nervous, as though he was afraid of something far worse than getting a ticket. "Where are you coming from?" Riley asked, his voice sharp. The driver cleared his throat, his voice cracking slightly as he replied, just passing through. I told you that. I'm not from around here, just needed to get her home. Riley took a slow, deliberate step closer to the man, his eyes locked on his. He wasn't buying it. The driver's story didn't add up. The way he was acting, the way he was avoiding direct questions, it didn't make sense. Listen, I've been doing this job for a long time, Riley said, his tone more serious now. People don't act like this unless they're hiding something. The man's breath caught in his throat. He looked as though he were about to speak, but then he glanced over at the car again. Riley followed his gaze. The little girl was still sitting quietly in the back seat, staring ahead, her face pale and expressionless. Riley felt his gut tighten. There was something terrifyingly off about the whole situation. Before Riley could say anything more, the man suddenly spoke, his voice filled with urgency. Look, I told you, she's my daughter. We don't need any trouble. Just let us go. Please. Riley stepped back, keeping his eyes on the driver. Something in the man's tone made the officer feel uneasy. The desperation in his voice didn't feel right. It wasn't the plea of a father trying to get home. It was the plea of someone who was trying to cover up something far darker. Riley glanced over at the little girl again, his mind working quickly. The more he thought about it, the more his doubts grew. No child this young would sit silently for so long, especially not when they were being driven around at night by a man who couldn't even keep his story straight. Why had the girl been so quiet? Why had she only spoken that one time? And why hadn't the driver been more concerned about her? Riley's instincts screamed that this wasn't just some routine traffic stop. The father's strange behavior, the way he was trying to avoid questions, everything pointed to the fact that the man was hiding something. He couldn't let this go. Not now, not after what he'd seen. The officer's hand hovered near his radio. He could call for backup, but he wasn't sure if that was the right move just yet. He didn't want to let the driver get away with whatever he was hiding, but he also didn't want to escalate things too quickly. He had to keep the man talking. He had to figure out what he was hiding before he did anything else. But the more Riley thought about it, the more he realized there was something terribly wrong with this entire situation. And the closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous it felt. With his mind racing, Riley finally spoke again, his voice low but firm. I'm not letting you go until I get some answers. Now I'm going to need to take a look at that backseat. Step away from the car. Now. The man's eyes widened in fear, and for a moment, Riley thought he might try to run. But he didn't. Instead, the man took a deep breath and reluctantly stepped back, his face pale. His eyes flickered once more at the backseat, where the little girl sat, her eyes locked on Riley. Something in that glance told Riley everything he needed to know. The man wasn't just hiding the truth, he was terrified of what would happen if Riley found out what was really going on. And now, with everything coming to a head, the officer was more certain than ever that this was no ordinary traffic stop. Riley was about to get the answers he needed. He just hoped it wasn't too late. Officer Riley's heart pounded as he slowly moved towards the backseat, his flashlight shining into the dark interior of the sedan. The little girl, still silent, was watching him closely, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperation. Riley could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. He wasn't sure what he would find, but he knew he couldn't ignore the signs any longer. Something had to be wrong, and it was time to get to the truth. He reached for the door handle, his fingers trembling slightly. The driver, still standing by the front of the car, looked more frantic now. His body was stiff, his eyes darting between Riley and the back seat. He swallowed hard, the fear evident in his movements. Riley glanced at him one last time, trying to read the man's intentions. What was he hiding? Why was he so afraid? The officer opened the door and shone his flashlight into the backseat. For a moment, all Riley could see was the girl, still sitting perfectly still, clutching her worn stuffed bear. Her small, delicate form seemed almost too fragile to be real. But then, Riley's eyes fell on something else. There, beneath the little girl's feet, was a large duffel bag. It was out of place in the back seat, bulky and strange. The kind of bag someone would carry if they were transporting something, or someone, important. His heart skipped a beat as he focused on the bag. There was something in it. Without thinking, Riley bent down and reached for the bag, his fingers brushing against the cold fabric. As he unzipped it, his stomach churned with dread. Inside the bag was a pile of money, stacks of cash wrapped in rubber bands. Riley froze for a moment, trying to process what he was seeing. This wasn't just some family trip gone wrong. This wasn't just a nervous driver. This was something much bigger. He turned around to face the man, his voice now cold and commanding. "What is this?" he asked, pointing at the bag. The driver's face went even paler, and his hands began to tremble uncontrollably. He opened his mouth as though to speak, but no words came out at first. Riley could see the panic building in the man's eyes. He was caught, and there was no way out. He had nowhere to hide the truth anymore. I didn't mean for this to happen," the man finally stammered, his voice cracking. I was just trying to get out of town. I didn't want to hurt anyone." Riley's suspicion only grew stronger. This wasn't a simple case of a nervous man with a child in the car. This was something far more complicated. But Riley needed more than just words. He needed answers. "Who are you running from?" Riley demanded, his gaze fixed on the man. The driver's eyes flickered to the backseat and then back to Riley. His breath was shallow, as though the weight of the truth was finally crashing down on him. "I wasn't supposed to get involved in this. It's bigger than me. I swear, I just wanted to keep her safe." Riley's confusion deepened. He glanced at the little girl again, who was still staring straight ahead, her eyes distant. Her silence was deafening. What did she know? Why wasn't she saying anything? The officer took a deep breath and stood up, trying to piece together what was going on. He turned his focus back to the driver, who was visibly shaking now. "Who is she, really?" Riley asked again, his voice softening just a little. "Is she your daughter?" The man hesitated, his eyes flickering with guilt. Slowly, he shook his head. "No, she's not my daughter. She's just a little girl I found." His voice broke as he spoke, and Riley could see the weight of his words settling heavily on his shoulders. "I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't leave her there. I couldn't." Riley's mind raced. "Where did you find her?" he pressed. The man's eyes welled up with tears, and for the first time, his voice cracked with emotion. "I found her in the back of a warehouse. Her parents, they were involved in something bad. They owed people money, dangerous people." The realization hit Riley like a punch to the gut. The man had found the girl, but only after something terrible had happened to her parents. He was trying to protect her, but why the secrecy? Why the money? The answer was clear now. The driver had been mixed up in something far more dangerous than he had let on. The officer glanced at the little girl again, her face now showing signs of exhaustion. Riley could see the fear in her eyes, but there was also something else, a faint glimmer of hope. She wanted to be saved. She needed to be saved. "Why didn't you bring her to the police?" Riley asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The answer seemed so simple. Why had the driver chosen to run instead of bringing the girl to safety? The man shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "I couldn't. I knew if I did, they would come after her. I couldn't let that happen. I thought if I just kept her hidden for a while, everything would blow over." Riley's stomach twisted with disgust. The driver had thought he could protect the little girl, but in doing so, he had dragged her deeper into a world of danger and deceit. The money, the secrecy, the lies. It was all part of a bigger, darker story. Riley took a deep breath. "You should have brought her to us," he said quietly, his voice firm. "We could have kept her safe." The driver finally collapsed to his knees, his face buried in his hands as the weight of his mistakes came crashing down on him. The officer knew he had to act quickly. He couldn't let the situation spiral any further. As Riley reached for his radio, ready to call for backup, he glanced at the little girl one last time. Her eyes met his, and for the first time since this full encounter began, she smiled, a small, hesitant smile, as if to say thank you. The officer's heart softened. He was going to make sure she was safe, no matter what. As Officer Riley stepped back from the sedan, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The truth was finally starting to make sense. The girl wasn't the driver's daughter, and the driver wasn't just some nervous father. He had found her in a warehouse, and now she was wrapped up in a mess of dangerous criminals, money, and lies. The officer had already made the decision to call for backup and get the little girl to safety. But just as he was about to reach for his radio, a sudden noise snapped him out of his thoughts. It was a distant, rumbling sound, a car engine. Riley's head whipped around, his instincts flaring to life. The sound was getting closer, much closer. The driver's eyes flickered nervously, glancing toward the road behind them. His hands were shaking, and his entire body was tense, as if he had been waiting for this moment. He didn't need to say anything. Riley could read the fear in his eyes. Whatever was happening now, it wasn't good. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the night like twin blades of danger. Riley's heart skipped a beat. The sound of the engine was unmistakable. It was speeding toward them, fast. "They found us," the driver muttered under his breath, panic rising in his voice. Riley's eyes narrowed. He didn't need the man to explain. The urgency in his voice was clear. Whoever had been chasing the driver and the little girl was getting closer, and they weren't coming for a friendly conversation. Before Riley could even react, the car roared closer, its headlights blinding him for a moment. He could hear the tires screeching against the pavement as it pulled into the parking lot just a few yards away. The sedan's engine revved violently as it tried to pull away, but the driver froze, his face pale with terror. The headlights from the other car swung wide, illuminating the entire scene. The officer's breath caught in his throat. The vehicle was a black SUV, its tinted windows making it impossible to see who was inside. But Riley could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. The people in that SUV weren't here to talk. They were here for something much worse. The officer reached for his weapon, his heart hammering in his chest. He had no idea how many people were in the SUV, but he knew they weren't just going to walk away. They were dangerous, and the girl's life was at risk. "You need to get back in the car," Riley barked at the driver, his voice sharp and full of urgency. "We're going to get you out of here, now." The driver's eyes were wide, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. I can't. They'll follow us. They'll kill us both," he said, his voice a mixture of fear and desperation. Riley's grip on his gun tightened. He couldn't just let them escape, not when the girl was in danger. But he also couldn't let them get caught in a shootout with whoever was in that SUV. He had to think fast. As the SUV screeched to a halt just behind them, Riley made a split-second decision. He couldn't let the driver get away. He couldn't let them slip into the night, not when the truth had finally come to light. He quickly moved to the front of the sedan, hoping to block the way to make sure the driver didn't try to run. The SUV's engine roared again, and Riley could feel the ground beneath him vibrating with the power of the vehicle. The door to the SUV slammed open, and the sound of boots hitting the pavement echoed through the night. Riley's mind raced, calculating his options. He could try to arrest the driver, but the real danger was still out there. Whoever was in that SUV wasn't going to stop until they got what they wanted. "Stay here," Riley ordered the driver, his voice cold but full of authority. "I'll handle this." The driver looked at him, his eyes wide with fear, but Riley didn't give him a chance to argue. He turned toward the approaching figures, gripping his gun tightly. There were two men emerging from the SUV, their faces hidden behind dark sunglasses, even though it was the middle of the night. Their movements were slow and deliberate, like predators on the hunt. Riley's heart raced, but his training kicked in. He needed to stay calm. He needed to control the situation. "Who are you?" Riley demanded, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. "What do you want?" The taller of the two men stepped forward, his hand resting on the side of his waistband as if he were reaching for something. Riley's finger hovered over the trigger of his gun, ready to defend himself if he had to. "We're not here for you, officer," the man said, his voice low and menacing. "We're here for the girl. Hand her over." Riley's stomach turned. They were here for the girl. He had been right. This was about far more than just a missing child. These people weren't just involved in some petty crime. They were dangerous, and they weren't going to back down. The officer took a step forward, trying to maintain control of the situation. He couldn't let them have her. He couldn't let these criminals take the little girl back into their world. The girl needed to be safe. He needed to protect her, no matter the cost. "I'm not getting you anything," Riley said, his voice firm. "This girl is under my protection. You're going to have to go through me." The man smirked, a cruel grin spreading across his face. "We're not leaving without her. And trust me, officer, you don't want to make this harder than it has to be." Riley's pulse quickened, but he wasn't about to back down. He couldn't let fear control him now. The girl's life was in his hands. Just as the man moved to take a step toward him, Riley heard a noise, soft but unmistakable. The little girl's voice, trembling with fear but still clear enough for Riley to hear. "Help me." It was the same desperate plea she had whispered earlier, and this time, Riley knew he couldn't wait any longer. He had to act fast. With his heart racing and his mind focused, Riley raised his gun, ready to protect the little girl at all costs. The chase had just begun, and he wasn't about to let them take her back into their dangerous world. Not on his watch. The moment Riley raised his gun, the world around him seemed to slow down. His hand was steady, his heart pounding in his chest. The two men from the SUV were now standing just a few feet away, their expressions unreadable, but the air between them was thick with tension. The little girl's desperate voice still echoed in his mind. Her plea for help was everything. Riley couldn't let her fall back into their hands. He focused, breathing deeply, trying to remain calm in the face of danger. He knew this moment could change everything. He could either make it out alive or face the consequences of a deadly standoff. But his duty was clear: protect the child, no matter what. The taller man gave him a cold, dismissive glance. "You're making a big mistake, officer," he sneered. "You think you can stop us? You have no idea who you're dealing with." Riley's finger hovered near the trigger, but his mind raced. He didn't want this to escalate into a shootout. His training kicked in. He knew he had to buy time. He had to keep the situation under control, at least until backup arrived. The officer's voice was steady, despite the pounding in his chest. "You're not taking her. Not today. Now step back and get in your vehicle. I don't want this to get ugly." But the man didn't listen. In fact, he smirked again, his hand reaching into his jacket. Riley's eyes locked onto his movement. His gut screamed that something was about to happen. His instincts were right. In an instant, the man pulled out a gun, aiming it directly at Riley. Time seemed to freeze. Riley's finger tensed on the trigger. But before he could react, the man's body jerked, as if he'd been hit by a shockwave. The SUV's engine roared in the distance, but Riley's attention was fixed on the taller man, who now stumbled back, dropping his weapon to the ground with a loud clatter. Riley blinked, confusion flooding his mind. Had he been shot? Had someone else intervened? Then he saw it, a flash of movement from the side. A black car had pulled up, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The door swung open, and from the shadows emerged a figure that Riley didn't recognize. But the sight was unmistakable. He was here to help. It was Detective Green, one of Riley's trusted colleagues. Green's eyes were locked on the scene, his own gun drawn, his stance ready. "You okay?" Green asked, his voice a little breathless. Riley nodded, his pulse still racing. "Thanks, I was about to need a miracle." His eyes never left the men in front of him. The shorter man from the SUV had been stunned by the sight of Green, and he hesitated just long enough. Riley took the opportunity to step forward, maintaining his aim. "You heard the man," Riley said sharply. "I suggest you put your hands in the air and get down on the ground. Now." The two men didn't need to be told twice. The taller one, still reeling from the unexpected intervention, dropped to his knees, his hands raised in surrender. The shorter one followed suit, his face twisted in disbelief. Green moved quickly, handcuffing both of them before they could make any move. The whole situation had been tense, and Riley could feel the weight of everything finally lifting, if only a little. The girl. His attention turned back to the back seat of the sedan, where she had remained throughout the chaos. Her eyes, wide and full of fear, were now softened with a glimmer of hope. Riley didn't move right away. He just stared at her, a wave of relief washing over him. They had done it. Slowly, he approached the car, his movements careful and deliberate. He didn't want to scare her. He didn't want her to feel like she was still in danger. When he was close enough, he knelt beside her, keeping his voice gentle. "It's okay now," he said softly, offering her a reassuring smile. "You're safe. Everything's going to be all right." She didn't answer immediately. She just looked at him, her small face a mixture of confusion and exhaustion. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "Are they gone?" Riley nodded. "They're gone. You don't have to be scared anymore." The little girl didn't say anything more, but she shifted slightly, her small hand reaching for her stuffed bear. Riley's heart broke as he watched her. He knew she had been through something unimaginable. She was so young, so fragile, but she was finally free. Green moved in behind Riley, and for a brief moment, the two officers exchanged a glance. They knew the danger wasn't fully over. The men in the SUV were just the beginning. There were still people out there who would do anything to get the girl back. But for now, Riley couldn't think about the next steps. He focused on the moment. The girl was safe. They had stopped a dangerous situation before it got worse. "Where's your mom and dad?" Riley asked gently, trying to get some sense of her background. The girl's gaze dropped to her stuffed bear, her lips trembling. They're gone," she whispered, her voice so soft it almost broke Riley's heart all over again. Riley swallowed hard. The girl had lost everything, and now she was alone. But she wasn't alone anymore. Not while he was here. "We're going to take care of you," Riley said firmly, his voice full of compassion. "You're not alone anymore." As Green finished securing the criminals and calling for backup, Riley remained beside the little girl, giving her the comfort she needed after such a traumatic experience. This wasn't the end of her story, not by a long shot. But it was the beginning of her being safe, of getting the care she deserved. And for Riley, that was all that mattered right now. The nightmare was over for her. But it wasn't over for the criminals, not by a long shot.